Welcome back. Just a quick reminder that I have a few slots available for chess lessons. You can find out more on chessopenings.com/lessons. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In this game, I play against an opponent by the wonderful name Grumpy Guru. And in the game, I managed to get a slightly inferior position out of the Danish Gambit, but after some fighting back, I get a good position, and then a better position, and then a winning position. Let's take a look at the action. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a Blitz game that I played on chess.com against a player by the name of Grumpy Guru. This is part of a collection of videos in which I'm going to describe my thinking processes and some of the strategy and tactics which took place during some Blitz games that I played. It's my hope that by studying these videos, you're going to get a chance to take a look at different kinds of positions and to grow your understanding and enjoyment of the game as a whole. In this game, I was rated almost 100 points higher than my opponent and managed to, well, we'll actually keep the result secret for now. So the game began with the move pawn to e4. I'm black in this position. And I continued with the move pawn to e5, usually my standard reply to the king's pawn opening. White now opened up with the move pawn to d4. Now, the move knight to f3 is much more common in this position. And as we've talked about in some of the videos, the idea of this move is to put some pressure on the e5 pawn, and then force black to play the move knight to c6. And this is important because later on, white will be able to play c3 and d4 as part of his strategy, typically, and black will lack the same strategy for some time because his knight is now in front of the c7 pawn. So this move, knight to f3, already creates a kind of concession, and at the same time, white will get his bishop out to the b5 square, he'll get castled early, and then there are some chances for white to gradually gather up a positional advantage. However, in this game, my opponent goes for the move pawn to d4, which is a sort of gambit here, because after e takes d4, white then continued with pawn to c3. The move queen takes d4 is also possible, but allows black to gain some time at the expense of the queen with knight to c6. So move pawn to c3 is a kind of gambit line which is well known. And in this game, I simply went ahead and pushed the pawn up to the d3 square rather than going for the gambit after d takes c3, knight takes c3. Now, in my opinion, this position is probably a little bit better for black, and black should go ahead and go for this free pawn here, because after all, white has simply gained an extra tempo for his development with the knight on c3, and he's gained some open lines for his pieces, but it should not provide completely adequate compensation for the pawn. Whereas after my move pawn to d3, I'm simply assisting white in getting on with his development, which he did, but I'm simply hoping that I'll be able to outplay white from this position and that he'll be a little bit less prepared. So the game continued. Bishop takes d3, knight c6. Knight f3 was played, pawn to d6, preventing the move pawn to e5. h3, this seemed unusual here, but simply white is avoiding the move bishop to g4. And now I continued with the move knight to f6, castles kingside, bishop to e7, knight b to d2, and now I castled kingside. Now, in my opinion, black's position is a little bit worse here, because he's down in space with the pawn on e4 against the pawn on d6, and this bishop is going to have some troubles finding areas to move. For example, one option for white here is to simply play queen c2, and then if we look at this position, it's a little bit difficult for black's development to unfold in a natural way. For example, if I play the move bishop to e6, white may be able to continue with knight g5, attacking this bishop. Now the bishop would retreat. Black would be getting ready to play h6, but now f4 could happen. h6, knight f3, and this is quite a space advantage for white, And white has the makings of an eventual kingside attack. He can try all kinds of different things here. He can move the pawn up to f5. He can simply hold on to his space advantage with knight c4. He can think about moving the pawn to e5. He can think about pawn to g4. There's a lot which white can potentially do in this position, and at the same time, not so much which black can do. So it's not so easy to bring the bishop out here because of this move. And in general, black is going to be facing this kind of problem, period. In fact, black will probably need to play a move like knight to e5, or maybe prepare it with knight to d7 followed by knight to e5. And in both cases, black is slightly worse. White has more plans available, but the position is not terminal yet. So white actually played rook to e1. I now, in fact, continued with the move knight to e5. And now I think if white simply continues knight takes e5, d takes e5, and knight c4, black is going to find himself with some problems in holding on to the e5 pawn, which will be somewhat awkward to defend. And this knight on c4 has arrived at a wonderful location because it's going to be quite difficult for black to kick this knight out unless he's willing to agree to some kind of tragic weaknesses on the queen side after the move pawn to b5. So this would be a simple way of continuing. But, as often happens, white does not find the appropriate response, in my opinion, to this move. He simply plays bishop to c2, and this is one of the reasons why I was willing to allow a slightly worse position out of the opening. One of the techniques which all players have available to them in order to create imbalances in the position is to actually be willing to take risk, to create situations where we are slightly worse. Because what does it mean to be slightly worse? It doesn't mean that the position loses by force. What it means is that the opponent should have slightly more options available in order to proceed and have a slightly favorable position, whereas we as the defender have slightly less options available for us without getting to a much worse position. Let me say that again. In a slightly worse position, usually the defender will find that he might have one or two feasible strategies, whereas the attacker might have 2 or 3 feasible strategies on his disposal. Therefore, the game still depends upon whether or not we, as the slightly worse player, are able to come up with the better ideas than our opponent has. And in this game, I'm able to show time and time again that I'm able to slightly play better than my opponent, even though he has more options available. And this is the beginning of this process. So now I retreat the knight to g6, simply getting the knight out of the way and preparing to bring my rook to e8, which will be an open file now. So he continues knight f1, rook e8. The rook is now on an open file. Knight to g3, h6. This is preparing to play the move bishop to f8 without having to worry about bishop to g5. So first h6, knight to d4 was played, bishop to f8. Okay, once again, I think black's position looks a little bit shaky, but he's managed to keep the game going. He's moved his knight from c6 all the way to g6, and by doing so, I've liberated my c-pawn. I've also in the process gotten my rook to a stronger file where it's exerting some pressure, and now my opponent played knight d to f5, and here I miss an opportunity to immediately equalize the game with the move pawn to d5, which is going to force a trade of pawns in the center, get my pieces flushed out in the position, and there's absolutely no reason to think that black is worse after e takes d5, rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and queen takes d5. This basically equalizes the game here. But instead, again, this is a blitz game. I went ahead and played bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, and now knight to e7, trying to liquidate in a completely different way. And now he plays knight to e3, and then I really like this move, pawn to c5. I love the risk-taking here, particularly in blitz, where it can be good enough just to create some situations. Again, this might not be the optimal move in the position, but it creates some imbalances. I'm simply moving the c-pawn forward, getting ready perhaps to move this knight back to c6, and then to see what kind of options are available afterwards. If I can get a slight inaccuracy out of white, so much the better. So it seems to me that the move knight g4 would have been the best move here. After knight takes g4, queen takes g4, and now white can simply get on with his development with bishop e3 and start targeting the d6 pawn, and notice that my bishop on g7 is poorly placed, and at the moment there's a threat of bishop takes g6, so I'd probably play knight g6, bishop e3, and white has a long-term advantage based on this pawn on d6 and the misplaced bishop on f8. However, once again, a slightly worse position is going to be one in which the opponent has access to such possibilities, but not all the time do we see that the opponent capitalizes. And so he plays bishop to a4, my knight returns to c6, and now a terrible move, pawn to f3. This just creates a lot of weaknesses and doesn't contribute to the position in any way. The pawn on e4 was temporarily under attack, but it was possible for white to play the move knight d5 in this position, which creates a bunch of different tactical ideas. I'm going to leave that alone for this video just to keep things moving, but it's worth a look at what could have happened if white played knight d5 on your own time if you'd like to take a look. But instead he plays the move f3. This is not good. Rook to c8, avoiding doubled pawns and mobilizing the rook a little bit here. Knight f5, and this time around, I don't miss the opportunity to play pawn to d5, and finally, black has equalized. I've eliminated the main problems of the position, which were related to the pawn on d6 and the bishop on f8. I've now gotten rid of the weakness on d6. My bishop suddenly increases its scope and will later on be able to find good play, and at the moment, white has created some weaknesses. His situation on the king side doesn't make a whole lot of sense, so he's created some holes on the dark squares. And now suddenly the position is beginning to reverse. White captures on c6, another very cooperative move. Rook takes c6, so I now have the bishop pair. e5, another mistake. Rook c to e6, creating a pin. Bishop to f4, again a terrible mistake here. Knight h5, queen d2, and now I simply take on f4, queen takes f4, and without a second thought, I played the move queen to g5, quickly detecting that the pawn on e5 is going to be lost here. Why is this pawn going to be lost? Well, at the moment, it's what is called an underprotected pawn. The pawn on e5 in this position is attacked twice and defended twice, which ordinarily means that the pawn cannot be won by black just yet. However, after the move queen g5, I'm threatening to get rid of one of his defenders, the queen on f4, and notice the queen can't simply move away from the attack because now the knight on f5 would be hanging. So there's only a couple places white can move the queen where she'll continue to defend both the pawn on e5 and the knight on f5. For example, only the g4 square meets these requirements without the queen being hanging, but of course then I would simply capture and then capture on e5. And after the move queen takes g5, h takes g5, I now have two attackers against the pawn on e5, and at the same time he has one defender, but he cannot manage to bring another defender to the e5 pawn. Therefore the pawn is lost, and there are no sufficient counter threats that white has in this position. For example, if he tries to attack the pawn on d5, either with knight e3, rook takes e5, now there's a pin, and also the pawn ends up being defended by the rook. And if white tries the move rook to d1, again trying to attack the d5 pawn, there's rook takes e5, which again brings the defender to the d5 pawn and incidentally creates another threat against the knight. Another opportunity to try to create a counter threat would be knight d6, attacking the rook, but simply bishop takes d6, and the bishop can't even be recaptured because of the pin. And all of this, it just so happens I was able to see this fairly quickly, and so after queen g5, the pawn on e5 is in fact lost. He tried the move pawn to g3, which attempts to replace the queen with a new defender with g takes f4, but this was quickly handled with pawn to g6, which simply pushes the knight out of the way so that I can then resume with rook takes e5. I've got three attackers on that point. He's going to lose the pawn. So white finally captures on g5, h takes g5, And now from here, I'm guaranteed a very nice position. Let's say that he continues knight e3, which is basically the only move here. Rook takes e5, and then he basically needs to agree to rook trades. And from this position, I have a nice advantage. I've got the extra pawn on the d file. I'll probably move the bishop to g7, get my king centralized, and then keep this endgame going for some time in a blitz game. And I have excellent winning chances in this position. But instead, my opponent topped off the game with one more bizarre and final mistake. He played knight d6. No doubt he was flustered by the sudden reversal events. And suddenly I played bishop takes d6. And because of the pin, white resigned. And so I won this game. What have we learned from this game? Well, we're going to see it again and again and again in this collection of videos. We're going to see again and again that actually one of the strategies which we have available in chess is to take a slightly worse position. Emanuel Lasker had a reputation of using this idea very often. It's very common for Lasker, one of the world champions, to have gotten slightly worse positions and then end up winning the games. And there's a dictum in chess that the hardest thing to do is win a one position. Oftentimes the opponent can get lazy, or he can be filled with adrenaline, and he can fail to make use of the tiny nuances which he's getting in these slightly better positions. He still has to play great chess. And if we play great chess from a slightly worse position, our winning chances continue to be quite high, because a slightly worse position is always going to have some kind of imbalances available. So here, I took on a position very quickly that was slightly worse for me, but the opponent, on a couple key occasions, didn't manage to find the right procedures, and therefore I suddenly equalized the game, and then suddenly got a slightly better position, and then won a piece. First of all, a pawn, and then a piece. And so this shows one of the psychological and strategic strategies which are at our disposal, and at the same time we got to see certain motifs in this position, such as black suddenly liberating his position with the move pawn to d5. You got a chance to see how I handled that slightly worse position, and how I was able to turn the tide. I hope that's been somewhat helpful for players today. I'm very appreciative that you've taken the time to take a look at this video. And as always, I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, be sure to check out the 2 applications we have available for the King's Indian Defense, available for iPhone and for Android.